in the history of mysticism, he has that kind of preeminent place. Another thing that we should say is that he is a Dominican. That is, early in his life, in his mid-teens, he already joined the Order of Preachers, which is the order in which Thomas Aquinas had been a member, and Albert the Great, and of course founded by St. Dominic, and the ethos or the spirituality associated with those friars, those preaching friars, would have a tremendous influence on Eckhart as well. There's a lot we do not know about the life of Eckhart, which is strange, given how his reputation as a master has come down to us. But he was born in 1260, the latter part of the 13th century, although many of the dates that I give you cannot be precise. They might vary by a year or two depending upon whom you might read, just because many dates are not easy to pin down with respect to his life. He was born in Germany, and again, that context, German mysticism, helps us or will help us to appreciate him, because in Germany at the time, late 13th and in the 14th century, there was a tremendous proliferation and flowering of mysticism and mystical thought, not only in religious communities, but also among the laity. There would have been at the time of Eckhart, in the 14th century, a movement known as the Friends of God. Not a formal movement, but there were those many connected with each other who might even sign a letter, a friend of God. And Eckhart was in some ways a kind of spiritual father for that Friends of God movement. Likewise, some of the, if you wish, disciples of Eckhart, two Dominicans in particular, Johannes Tauler, or John Tauler, Heinrich or Henry Suso, two quite well-known mystical writers as well, very influenced by the thought of Eckhart, and they continued to have their influence throughout the centuries. But particularly in Germany at the time, a wide proliferation of communities of women or women recognized for their mystical life. We can think of someone today well-known, Hildegard of Bingen, earlier than Eckhart, but it reflects that among the laity, and especially among women at that time, there is a growing appreciation in some ways for the kind of mysticism that was being nourished in Dominican circles, which in many ways had a intellectual or studied aspect to it, and yet touched deeply, you could say, the life of the soul. And so the Beguines would be associations of women, lay women, but women coming together to live a more deeply spiritual life, often gathering together in a beguinage, not as a formal religious community, not as a monastery, not juridically formed in any way, but nevertheless coming together, living a life of much more simplicity and poverty, and yet given to active works of charity. These women, nuns, as well as the Beguines, as well as others, would be those that, especially later in his life, Eckhart's ministry would be very much involved with. Anyway, in his mid-teens, he joins the Order of Preachers, and the program of study for him is going to be fairly similar to what any Dominican at that time would have undergone, probably 8 years of study, first initial studies and then theology. Some of that may have been done in Paris, but certainly the theological study, and most of it, would have happened in Cologne. In fact, we could keep in mind some of the cities with which Eckhart is going to be very much associated. Paris, certainly, because he will go and teach there, but especially otherwise Strasbourg and Cologne, that whole Rhineland kind of area. After his period of study, he is sent by the order to teach in Paris, which again shows the esteem, the recognition that he was chosen among all to go and actually be a lecturer in Paris, where he lectured on the sentences, what were known as the sentences of Peter Lombard, which would have been the classic text in many ways. At that time, in any theological study, a person began as a teacher by really lecturing on the sentences of Lombard. And at that point, one would not be teaching in his